谢清晨，感谢杨天，感谢艺人，感谢散医生，感谢如是我闻。谢谢观众朋友们对于我们的支持。稍后华尔街联报继续为您带来过去24小时的最新评论、消息以及其他精彩内容。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。纽约时报报道，随着中国面临越来越大的经济复苏的压力，北京的最高领导人们正在试图引导经济走上新的道路，不再依赖房地产和地方债务来推动经济增长，转而加大对制造业的投资，并且增加中央政府的借贷。他们的最新经济计划是要更多的半导体，更少的房地产。上周公布的数据显示，自2005年中国有记录以来，中国国有银行首次开始持续减少房地产贷款，大量资金转而流向制造商，尤其是电动汽车和半导体等快速增长的行业。而这种做法显然存在一定的风险。中国的工厂长期是供过于求，供应已经远远超过国内市场的需求，更加重视制造业可能会导致中国需要更多的出口，而出口的增加又会与中国的贸易伙伴对立，对一些西方国家构成威胁。比如说，拜登政府的降低通货膨胀法案就是为了促进对半导体等类似行业的额外投资。向制造业提供更多贷款的转变，凸显了北京不愿意救助负债累累的中国房地产市场。占中国经济1/4的建筑和房地产行业目前正遭受着价格、销售和投资的急剧下降。中国对先进制造业的投资推动可能会在未来几个月刺激更多的增长，抵消部分房地产部门的问题。但是，增加中央政府的举债来替代地方政府的举债，对于化解债务危机对经济的拖累作用并不大。渣打银行的中国首席经济学家丁爽最近在广州举办的首席经济学家论坛上说：“我认为中国短期发展没有问题，问题是中长期发展。”他说，房地产还没有跌到底线。中国的住房危机源于40年来由债务引发的投机活动，这些活动将房价推高到远远超出租金或者家庭收入所能承受的正常水平。北京几年前突然收紧对房地产企业贷款的发放，从而引发了房地产行业的下滑。而现在，北京并不愿意通过再次启动贷款来拯救房地产行业。今年年初，北京认为中国经济将在2023年恢复增长，但是在经历了最初的一阵活跃之后，经济增长开始乏力，薄弱环节始终存在。制造业在8月和9月出现增长之后，10月再次陷入停滞，关键指标下跌。上周，在习近平主持的一次非公开会议上，最高领导层讨论了中国的金融政策。根据会后的官方声明，会议下令将更多的财政资源优先用于先进制造业，并且向地方政府提供援助。在中国房地产市场苦苦挣扎的同时，由政府支持的融资推动的工厂却在高歌猛进。中国已经建成的太阳能电池板工厂已经足以满足全世界的需求，中国已经建成的汽车工厂则足以生产在中国、欧洲和美国销售的每一辆汽车。到2024年底，中国建成的石化工厂数量将相当于欧洲、日本和韩国的石化工厂的总和，而中国只花了5年的时间。中国近期的国际金融论坛上，与会的经济学家承认，中国面临着自1976年毛泽东逝世后的几年以来从未遇到过的挑战，但他们预测对新制造技术的巨额投资将会带来回报。前中央政府经济计划部门的高级官员张燕生说，今天我们遇到了与1978年类似的困难，所以现在的问题是创新驱动增长的未来会是什么？新加坡国立大学东亚研究所所长霍夫曼在广州的活动上说，中国银行系统从房地产贷款转向制造业的转变始于几年前。在疫情爆发前，中国的银行每年向房地产增加的贷款超过7000亿美元，而在过去的1年中，房地产未偿贷款总额有所下降，银行减少了对开发商的贷款，家庭还清了旧的抵押贷款，同时减少了新的贷款。而相比之下，对工业企业的净贷款则从2019年前9个月的630亿美元猛增到今年前9个月的6800亿美元，短短3年翻了10倍。这些资金部分被用于建设半导体产业，让中国在美国实施出口管制的情况下得以与西方国家相竞争， 同时也用于电动汽车制造和造船等行业。许多经济学家担心，向制造业投入更多资金可能无法挽救更广泛的中国经济。房地产仍然在衰退，而且规模庞大，汽车制造业等高端制造业只占中国经济产出的 6% 到 7%。想要依靠这些行业的增长来抵消房地产行业的问题并不容易。中国的工厂建设热潮还有可能与其他国家形成对立。由于中国家庭缩减了消费，大部分新增产能可能会被用于出口，但是美国和欧盟已经不太愿意接受与中国的贸易逆差进一步增加。欧盟已经在调查中国电动汽车行业使用政府补贴的情况。由于意识到这些风险，中国正在向一些发展中国家示好。这些国家拥有相当规模但是较为老化的制造业，这为中国新建的高效工厂提供了出口的机会。许多发展中国家正在努力重新谈判与中国政府的巨额债务，这使得他们在提高中国商品关税方面处于弱势地位。几十年来，中国工厂的主导地位不断增强。根据联合国工业发展组织的数据，自2000年以来，中国在全球制造业中的份额增长了近5倍，达到 31%。美国的份额已经跌至 16%， 而不包括中国在内的发展中国家的份额则保持在 19% 的水平。但是无论是支持房地产还是支持制造业，中国的做法有一点没有改变，那就是仍然依靠借贷来推动经济增长。多年来，中国官方一再试图抑制债务上瘾。中国国务院前副总理刘鹤在2018年的一次讲话中曾经承诺要在3年内实现这一目标。然而，自2020年以来，地方政府债务激增，去年达到近8万亿元人民币。地方政府的融资工具平台又累积了数万亿元的贷款。相对于中国的经济产出而言，中国的总体债务已经膨胀到比美国和许多其他发达国家的债务还要大得多。北京大学国家发展研究院院长姚洋在9月份表示，中国债务控制的努力并未取得成功。他说，2014年至2018年本应是化解债务的窗口期，但是却债务猛增。2020年之后，情况变得更加糟糕。这表明之前的债务化解措施效果并不佳，在某些情况下甚至是适得其反。而在北京最新指示将资金转向制造业之后，大陆半导体公司长鑫存储近日从政府支持的基金获得了390亿元人民币的投资。据企查查数据显示，在最新一轮融资中，总部位于合肥的长鑫新桥存储技术有限公司获得大基金等3家企业共同注资达390亿元人民币。大基金是中国国家支持的集成电路产业的投资基金，是中国半导体行业的旗舰基金。另外2家投资企业也是与当地政府有关联的投资者。长鑫存储是大陆存储芯片的龙头企业。据彭博社今年早些时候报道，长鑫存储的目标是与美光科技和三星电子等全球领先企业相竞争，并且计划在中国要申请 IPO， 这可能会使长鑫存储的估值超过145亿美元。由于美国试图限制中国获得尖端芯片，北京一直致力于在半导体行业取得突破。随着华为于8月份发布了首个采用中国自制芯片制造的5G 手机，中国似乎取得了初步的成功。美国总统拜登将于本月晚些时候在旧金山举行的亚太经合组织峰会期间会见中国国家主席习近平。中美双方都寻求缓解紧张局势的方法，但是没有任何迹象表明华盛顿会放松对中国的技术限制。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道，我们下期节目再见。
历史上元首之间的会面可以产生各种趣事和有趣的瞬间。以下是一些例子：冷战时期的互动。冷战期间，美国总统与苏联领袖之间的会面经常引发了许多趣事。例如，1959年，美国总统理查德·尼克松与苏联领袖尼基塔·赫鲁晓夫在美国的一次会晤中进行了一场名为“厨房辩论”的非正式对话。他们在一间展示美国厨房的展览中争论了资本主义和共产主义的优劣。尼克松访华，1972年， 理查德·尼克松成为首位访问中华人民共和国的美国总统。这次历史性的访问标志着美中关系的正常化，尽管这次访问是为了政治目的，但它也充满了各种趣事，如尼克松与中国国家主席毛泽东的会面，阿道夫·希特勒与贝尼托·墨索里尼的会晤。希特勒和墨索里尼是二战期间的同盟国，他们之间的会面通常会有一些令人印象深刻的趣事，比如在会晤期间拍摄的合影。美国总统在任内和在公开场合中经常面对高压和重要问题，但他们有时也展现了幽默的一面。以下是一些美国总统的幽默瞬间。富兰克林 ·D· 罗斯福总统曾对自己的轮椅开玩笑，称其为不可或缺的伴侣。哈里 ·S· 杜鲁门总统因其风趣而闻名。他曾说过，如果你不能离得远点，就离开厨房。约翰 ·F· 肯尼迪总统曾在一次记者招待会上说，他的兄弟是一家出版社的主编，所以他自己在家里不写材料。理查德·尼克松总统也有一些幽默的瞬间。他曾在辞职演讲中说，他没有事先告诉妻子，他会为此感到震惊，但他会至少不会打电话来问他要买什么。罗纳德·里根总统以他的轻松和风趣而闻名。他曾在一次演讲中开玩笑说，政府的问题不是因为我们花钱太多，而是花错了地方。比尔·克林顿总统也以他的风趣而闻名。他曾在一个演讲中开玩笑说，他的总统图书馆将是第一家致力阅读不良的图书馆。奥巴马总统在多个场合展现了他的幽默感。他曾在一次记者招待会上开玩笑说，他的女儿才是家里真正的首席谈判官，因为他拥有坚强的谈判策略。这些幽默瞬间为美国总统增添了人性化的一面，尽管他们通常身负巨大的政治责任。这些瞬间也反映了总统在处理压力时如何运用幽默来缓解紧张氛围。中美元首之间有许多著名的会晤，这些会晤通常在国际事务和中美关系中具有重要意义。以下是一些著名的中美元首会晤。尼克松访华。1972年，美国总统理查德·尼克松访问中国，与中国国家主席毛泽东和总理周恩来举行了历史性的会晤。这次访问标志着中美关系的正常化，结束了两国之间长达数十年的冷战对抗。邓小平访美。1979年，中国国家主席邓小平访问美国，与美国总统吉米·卡特进行了会晤。这次访问加强了中美之间的外交关系，为双方未来的合作奠定了基础。江泽民访美。1997年，中国国家主席江泽民访问美国，与美国总统比尔·克林顿进行了会晤。这次访问强调了中美合作的重要性，并在经济、贸易和外交领域取得了一些进展。习近平访美。中国国家主席习近平多次访问美国，与不同届美国总统进行了会晤。其中，2013年和2015年，习近平与美国总统贝拉克·奥巴马举行了会晤，讨论了一系列重要议题，包括贸易、气候变化和地区安全等。习近平与特朗普的会晤。中国国家主席习近平与美国总统唐纳德·特朗普进行了多次会晤，其中一些在贸易、核问题和朝鲜半岛问题等领域取得了重要进展。这些会晤也反映了中美关系的复杂性和竞争性。这些是一些著名的中美元首会晤，他们在中美关系和国际事务中发挥了重要作用。这些会晤通常涵盖了各种政治、经济和地缘政治议题，影响着全球格局。里根与戈尔巴乔夫的亲切互动。美国总统罗纳德·里根和苏联领袖米哈伊尔·戈尔巴乔夫之间的亲切互动是冷战结束的重要因素之一。他们在会晤中常常展示友好的幽默感，例如， 里根曾经向戈尔巴乔夫展示一张讲述苏联笑话的卡片，这种轻松的互动有助于改善两国之间的关系。这些是历史上一些元首会面中的趣事，这些瞬间常常在国际政治历史中留下了深刻的印记。不过，元首会面通常也伴随着严肃的议题和政治决策，因此在背后的重要问题上也有许多复杂性。中美交往的历史中曾经发生过一些危机时刻，这些时刻通常涉及双方在政治、经济、军事和外交领域的分歧和紧张关系。以下是一些中美交往的危机时刻。台海危机。20世纪90年代，中美关系曾因台湾问题而陷入危机。1996年，中国进行了导弹军演，以回应台湾海峡危机。美国派遣2艘航母前往台湾海峡，加剧了紧张局势。2001年，中国美国军机相撞事件。2001年4月，一架美国 EP-3侦察机与中国战斗机相撞，导致中国飞行员丧生。美国飞机被迫降落在中国海南岛。这一事件引发了外交紧张，最终双方通过外交途径解决了危机。2012年钓鱼岛纠纷，中日之间围绕钓鱼岛，中国称钓鱼岛，日本称尖阁列岛的主权争端引发了紧张局势。美国表达了支持日本的立场，这引发了中国的不满和抗议。贸易战，自2018年以来，中美之间爆发了一场贸易战，双方相互加征关税，导致贸易关系紧张。这一争端在经济和贸易领域引发了广泛的担忧，尽管后来双方达成了一些协议，但贸易问题仍然存在分歧。南中国海争端，中国在南中国海地区的军事活动引发了与美国等国家之间的外交争端。美国坚持航行自由行动，以维护国际法和地区稳定，而中国则坚持主权主张。这些危机时刻反映了中美关系的复杂性，双方在各个领域都有不同的利益和立场。尽管存在紧张和争议，但中美之间也有合作的领域，如气候变化、反恐、朝鲜半岛问题等。这些问题需要双方寻求共识和合作。尽管中美之间存在复杂的关系和一些危机时刻，但也有一些合作和友好的佳话。以下是一些中美之间的佳话和合作领域。环保合作，中美在气候变化领域有合作，特别是在巴黎气候协定下，双方承诺采取行动减少温室气体排放。这种合作有助于全球减缓气候变化的影响。经济关系，中美之间的经济合作非常广泛，两国是全球最大的贸易伙伴之一。双方的贸易和投资关系对各自国家的繁荣都具有重要意义。教育和文化交流，中美之间的学术和文化交流非常丰富，包括学生和学者的互访、文化活动和艺术交流等。这有助于增进两国人民的相互了解和友谊。反恐合作，中美在反恐领域有一定程度的合作，包括情报分享和联合反恐行动。这有助于维护国际和地区安全。朝鲜半岛问题，中美都支持朝鲜半岛的和平与稳定，两国在解决朝核问题上曾有合作。这是一个共同关心的地区问题，需要双方的协调和努力。这些合作领域展示了中美之间不仅有分歧和紧张，还有许多可以合作的机会。双方在各种国际和地区问题上都扮演着重要的角色，因此合作和对话对维护全球和平与繁荣非常重要。历史上有一些国家元首外访时发生了意外事件，包括政变、袭击和其他不幸事件。以下是一些例子。约瑟夫·斯大林 Joseph Stalin 在1945年底，苏联领袖斯大林计划前往雅尔塔会议，与美国总统富兰克林·罗斯福和英国首相温斯顿·丘吉尔会面。然而，在斯大林的专列行驶途中发生了一次火车事故，虽然斯大林没有受伤，但这一事件仍然被视为一次潜在的刺杀企图。 约翰·肯尼迪 （John F. Kennedy）。1963年11月，美国总统肯尼迪访问德克萨斯州达拉斯市时遭到刺杀，不幸身亡。这是美国历史上的一次重大政治暗杀事件。亚塞尔·阿拉法特 （Yasser Arafat），巴勒斯坦领袖阿拉法特于2004年在法国巴黎的军事医院接受治疗，最终去世。虽然没有直接证据表明他是被毒死的，但他的死引发了各种争议和猜测。安瓦尔·萨达特 （Anwar Sadat），埃及总统萨达特在1981年的一场军事阅兵上遭到埃及伊斯兰圣战团成员的暗杀。这次袭击导致了萨达特的死亡。奥斯卡·阿里亚斯·桑切斯 （Oscar Arias Sanchez），哥斯达黎加前总统奥斯卡·阿里亚斯·桑切斯在1997年访问墨西哥时遭到了一次刺杀未遂事件，但他幸运地生还。这些事件只是历史上一些国家元首外访时发生的意外事件的例子，还有其他许多类似的事件。外访期间的国家元首通常会受到高度的安全保护，但仍然存在各种潜在的风险。虽然国家元首通常需要频繁地坐飞机出访和处理国内外事务，但有些国家元首也可能害怕坐飞机，或者有飞行恐惧症。这种情况可能因个人经历、心理原因或其他因素而异。以下是一些曾经表现出对坐飞机有害怕感的国家元首的例子：皮埃尔·特鲁多 （Pierre Trudeau），加拿大的前总理皮埃尔·特鲁多曾因为担心飞行而被视为害怕坐飞机的国家元首。然而，他仍然需要进行国际出访，尽管可能感到不舒服。美国前总统理查德·尼克松 （Richard Nixon） 尽管没有官方记录显示他对飞行有明确的恐惧症，但据说尼克松在总统任内时常感到不安，尤其是在飞行时。法兰索瓦·密特朗 （François Mitterrand），法国前总统密特朗据报道也有飞行恐惧症。他曾多次在国内和国际航班上表现出焦虑情绪。请注意，这些国家元首是否真的有飞行恐惧症或害怕坐飞机的情况，并不是公开透明的信息，而是一些传闻或报道。大多数国家元首都会接受专业的安全培训和飞行服务，以确保他们的飞行安全。国家元首经常外访，需要跨越多个时区，因此管理倒时差成为他们的一项挑战。以下是一些处理时差的方法：逐渐调整时间表，在国家元首计划的行程中，逐渐调整到目的地的时间。这可以通过提前或推迟飞行时长、调整休息时间以及适当的时间差来实现。使用协助工具，国家元首可以利用时差协助工具，例如特定的光疗设备，以帮助调整身体时钟。这些工具模拟自然光照，有助于适应新的时区。睡眠管理，维护良好的睡眠习惯对于处理时差非常重要。国家元首可以尽量在飞行前获得足够的休息，避免在飞行时过度疲劳。在目的地抵达后，尽量根据当地的日间和夜间模式来调整自己的睡眠时间。合理安排飞行时间，尽量避免在长途飞行后立刻参加重要会议或活动，给自己时间来适应时差。在目的地抵达后，可以安排一些轻松的活动，以帮助适应新的时区。饮食控制，饮食也可以影响时差调整。在长途飞行前后，控制咖啡因和酒精摄入，以及合理安排饮食时间，有助于身体适应新的时区。利用药物，在某些情况下，医生可能会建议使用短期服用药物来帮助调整时差。然而，这应该在医疗专业人员的监督下进行，以避免潜在的不良影响。国家元首的外访通常由专业的团队和安全人员管理，他们会帮助国家元首处理时差问题，并确保他们在外访期间能够维持最佳状态，以履行其职责。国家元首的外访安全是一个高度重要的任务，需要精心策划和实施。 以确保他们的安全和顺利完成任务。以下是保障国家元首外访安全的一些关键方面。安全计划和情报。在外访前，国家安全机构会进行详尽的情报工作，以评估潜在的风险和威胁。这些情报将用于制定安全计划，包括路线规划、住宿和通讯设备的安排。特种警卫和安全团队。国家元首通常由专业的特种警卫团队护送，这些团队接受高度训练，负责元首的身体安全。他们会密切合作，以应对潜在的威胁。交通安排。外访期间，特别的交通安排将被制定，包括飞机、车队和船只。这些安排将最大程度地减少元首的暴露，提高他们的安全性。安全通讯和通讯设备。国家元首将携带高度安全的通讯设备，以确保他们与国内政府和情报机构的联系畅通无阻。这些通讯设备通常采用加密技术，以防止信息泄露。安全检查和筛查。在外访前，所有参与元首接待的人员和设备都会接受严格的安全检查和筛查，以确保没有潜在的威胁或危险物品。风险评估和危机管理。安全团队会定期评估外访期间的风险，并制定危机管理计划。这些计划包括应对突发事件和危机的步骤。当地合作。与接待国的当地执法和安全机构进行密切合作，以共同确保国家元首的安全。安全措施的保密。外访的具体安全措施通常是高度机密的，以防止潜在的威胁或袭击者获得相关信息。这些措施通常都是综合考虑的，以确保国家元首在外访期间能够安全地履行他们的职责，并在遇到潜在威胁时迅速应对。外访的安全保障是一个复杂的任务，通常需要协调多个机构和专业团队的合作。国家元首外访时下榻酒店、就餐和居住通常是精心策划和组织的过程，以确保他们的安全和舒适。以下是一些通常用于安排国家元首外访的方法。酒店选择。酒店的选择通常是基于多个因素，包括安全、便捷、设施和服务等。通常会选择高档酒店，因为它们具有更高的安全标准和服务水平。特别策划的房间和套房通常用于国家元首和他们的团队。安全检查。在国家元首和他们的团队到达酒店之前，酒店通常会进行严格的安全检查，包括房间和设施的检查，以确保没有潜在的威胁或危险物品。专属服务。酒店会提供专门的服务，以满足国家元首的需求，包括私人厨师、医疗服务、安全人员和翻译等。餐饮安排。餐饮通常是特别策划的，以满足国家元首的口味和饮食需求。国家元首可能会在私人房间用餐，也可以选择在酒店的高级餐厅就餐。安全措施。酒店通常会加强安全措施，包括增加安保人员、使用监控设备、限制酒店员工的进出和加强访客筛查，以确保国家元首的安全。居住设施。国家元首和他们的团队通常需要一个私密、安全和舒适的住宿环境。这可能包括特别策划的套房、私人别墅或其他高级住宿设施。安全通讯。酒店也会提供高度安全的通讯设备，以确保国家元首与国内政府和情报机构的联系畅通无阻。旧金山的治安状况在不同社区和时间段之间有很大的差异，因此无法用一个简单的答案来概括。一般来说，旧金山是一个相对安全的城市，但也存在一些治安问题，包括犯罪率。旧金山的犯罪率相对较高，特别是在一些城市地区，包括盗窃、袭击和枪支犯罪。然而，这些问题通常集中在一些社区，而其他地区的治安相对较好。无家可归问题。旧金山地区存在大量无家可归者，他们在城市中露宿街头。这不仅是一个人道主义问题，还可能导致一些治安问题，如盗窃和滥用毒品。 毒品问题、毒品滥用和毒品相关犯罪问题在旧金山也相当严重，这包括毒品交易、滥用和相关的卫生和安全问题。社会紧张局势，一些社会紧张局势，如抗议活动和政治不满情绪，有时会导致示威、暴力事件和社会动荡，从而对治安产生影响。尽管存在这些治安问题，但旧金山也采取了一些措施来改善治安状况，包括加强警务资源、提供住房和心理健康服务、进行社区治安倡议和改善司法体制等。旧金山的治安问题可能受到多种因素的影响，其中一些因素包括经济差距。旧金山是一座高度发达的城市，但也存在着显著的贫富差距。贫困人口面临着住房不足、失业和医疗保健等问题，这可能导致一些人陷入犯罪和社会问题。无家可归问题，旧金山地区存在大量无家可归者，他们在城市中露宿街头，这不仅是一个人道主义问题，还可能导致一些社会问题，包括犯罪活动。毒品问题、毒品滥用和毒品相关犯罪问题在旧金山也相当严重。毒品滥用可能导致偷盗、暴力和其他犯罪行为。社会紧张局势，一些社会紧张局势，如抗议活动和政治不满情绪，有时会导致示威、暴力事件和社会动荡，从而对治安产生影响。执法和法律体制问题，一些人批评旧金山的执法和法律体制不足以应对犯罪和社会问题。警务资源不足，司法程序复杂以及对罪犯的宽松刑事司法政策可能导致犯罪行为不受严厉制裁。暴力犯罪，旧金山有时会经历暴力犯罪事件，包括枪击案件，这引发了社会担忧。需要指出的是，治安问题通常是复杂的，受多种因素的影响。政府、社会组织和社区一般需要合作来解决这些问题，采取综合的措施，包括改善社会经济条件、提供住房和心理健康服务、加强警务资源、改进司法体制等。这些努力有望改善城市的治安状况。
In November 2013, Xi Jinping, General Secretary of Chinese Communist Party, CCP, launched the manifesto for his decade in power. No one then anticipated a third term, at the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee. The decision on major issues concerning comprehensively deepening reforms was intended to be an epoch-defining set of changes. It needed to be, because the CCP leadership had concluded that the economic and social model followed since the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in 1978 was unbalanced, uncoordinated and unsustainable. When Jiabao, former premier of the People's Republic of China, PRC, had used this phrase in 2007, Xi Jinping repeated it in his remarks on the 2013 decision, and even as recently as last year. If the economic and social model was indeed unsustainable, then the purpose of the third plenum in 2013 was to reverse out of the cul-de-sac and find an alternative route forwards. This begs the question of whether the intervening decade has defined and implemented the reforms outlined to a degree such that a new model, or a new development concept, as Xi Jinping likes to say, has successfully been put in place. Such success or failure in turn begs the question of what role an economy-focused plenum 10 years later can play in reinforcing success or rectifying failure. Title II: The Third Plenum of 2013, Comprehensively Deepening Reform. In the 2013 Third Plenum documents, Xi Jinping set out a highly ambitious and wide-ranging reform program. He dealt not just with the economy. As Xi Jinping himself set out in his 2013 explanation concerning the CCP Central Committee resolution concerning some major issues in comprehensively deepening reform, the decision itself had 16 chapters, which he divided into 7 areas. Economic reform was clearly the most important. But the other 6 elements both underpinned economic reform and reflected Xi Jinping's wider ambitions. It is worth briefly highlighting the more important of the other elements, before moving on to the 4 bones of economic reform. An enduring preoccupation of Xi Jinping has been law-based governance. This was the theme of the 4th plenum in 2014. Professionalizing the law, broadening and systematizing its application, but above all building trust in it as the legal basis for economic and other activity represent important names. Without impartial law to protect entrepreneurs and build trust in the system, the energies of private enterprise are likely to be blunted. However, building protection and trust is undermined by the CCP declaration that the party itself is above the law. While the party wishes to keep politics and national security for its, and not the court's, discretion, both can be used by local officials or business rivals as cover to disadvantage private sector companies and competitors. Important too in 2013 was the intention to strengthen CCP control over the military. Xi Jinping's 7 areas of reform were broken down into 5+1+1, the ones being the military and CCP construction. This was the first time that military matters appeared as a separate topic at such a plenum. Since 2015, Xi Jinping has greatly transformed control of the People's Liberation Army, PLA, by revamping the Central Military Commission and the area commands. He has also replaced most commanders with those whom he trusts. Particular emphasis was placed on party building and discipline/corruption. Under the leading small group on comprehensively deepening reform, whose establishment was announced at the third plenum, were 6 other special groups covering the economy, ecology, democracy and the legal system, culture, the social system, party building and discipline inspection. The importance of the last was shown because the Disciplinary Inspection System Reform Group is listed separately and, in the list of members of the Deep Reform Team, 5 deputy secretaries of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection participated, more than any other unit. This is hardly surprising, since corruption had reached horrific levels such that when Xiaobao said that it could threaten the CCP's hold on power. How could reform, which must involve upfront expenditure before gains could be made, proceed if so much money was disappearing into cadres' pockets? Finally, it is worth noting that in the case of social issues, the third plenum was not just about reforms to improve the people's lot, but also about tightening control and practices which had grown flabby under the leadership of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Those who at the time hoped that Xi Jinping might be of a liberal persuasion clearly had not read the October 2011 Sixth Plenum, whose decision presaged the Xi Jinping-era controls over the media, education, the internet, religion, civil society, and more. While Xi Jinping was in charge of the drafting committee for the 2011 Sixth Plenum decision, preparation for the promised tightening of control had started before he came to power. In other words, to avoid the risk of losing power, CCP leaders had earlier decided to restore a muscular Leninism, even if Xi Jinping subsequently took it further than many may have anticipated. The third plenum reforms were to be completed in 7 years, by 2020, in time to meet the first centennial goal of achieving a moderately prosperous society. By 2020, the reform tasks put forward in this decision are to be completed within this period, and institutions and systems that are structurally complete, scientifically standardized and effective in operation are to be formed, to ensure that institutions in all areas become more mature and complete. A government report on a 31 December 2020 Tea Party of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, at which Xi Jinping spoke, claimed that more than 7 years after the third plenary session of the 18th Central Committee was held, a total of 2,485 reform programs have been launched by various parties, and the reform targets and tasks have generally been completed as scheduled. Such a claim sits ill with many other CCP pronouncements on the need for reform made since 2020. Title 2.1 limits on reform of the PRC's birdcage economy at the 2013 Third Plenum. In the PRC's Leninist system, economic reform is necessarily circumscribed. The best-known sentence from the Third Plenum is, ensuring that the market has a decisive role in the allocation of resources and giving better rein to the functions of government. This was a major theoretical viewpoint in this plenum resolution. Most commentators have focused on the decisive role, a step up from earlier language of basic role, but failed to consider the significance of strengthening the government role. Yet Xi Jinping was clear, give rein to the positive role of the party and the government. The market has a decisive role in resource allocation, but it does not have the total role. How could it in a Leninist system? In the famous document number 9, which prescribed 7 Western influences, the fourth don't speak inveighs against the promotion of neoliberalism, which attempts to change the PRC's basic economic system. Neoliberalism's advocates actively promote the market omnipotence theory. They claim our country's macroeconomic control is strangling the market's efficiency and vitality, and they oppose public ownership, arguing that China's state-owned enterprises are national monopolies, inefficient and disruptive of the market economy, and should undergo comprehensive privatization. These arguments aim to change our country's basic economic infrastructure and weaken the government's control of the national economy. No self-respecting Leninist can let go of the main economic levers, since the accumulation of wealth could lead to demands for political power. No taxation without representation echoes beyond North America of the 18th century. The CCP runs a birdcage economy, the words of Chen Yun, former vice premier of the PRC who led on economic policy. The question at issue has always been the size of the cage allowed by Leninism. Title III: 4 Crucial Areas of Reform. Amongst the myriad of 2013 reforms of the economic system, 4 areas stand out. Number 1, the system of administration and authorizations, which impinges upon the private sector. Number 2, SOEs. Number 3, finance and taxation, and Number 4, the connected issues of the Hukou system and rural land reform, which affect labor mobility and common prosperity. These are the pillars of reform set out in a book published in March 2017, which assessed reform progress after 3 years. The authors worked for the Institute of Economic System and Management, IESM, a think tank under the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC. Since the NDRC is charged with planning and implementing reform, their views are likely to carry weight. The book considered reform under the 4 headings above. A 5th was health reform, but, while important, this does not underpin other wider economic reforms. The authors were remarkably candid about the failure to reform after 3 years. It is unlikely that they would be so today, in the era of Xi Jinping's positive energy. Title 3.1.1 Administration and Authorizations. Administration and authorizations encapsulate the intention that, as the third plenum decision put it, we will persist in equality of rights, opportunities and rules, abolish all forms of irrational regulations for the non-public economy, remove all hidden barriers, and adopt specific measures for non-public enterprises to enter franchising fields. Despite 30 years of reform and relative encouragement of the private sector, it was still besieged by red tape, arbitrary interference, unreliable recourse to legal redress, locally imposed taxes, charges, fines, and much more. In 2017, the NDRC's IESM listed some success in tackling the problems of red tape and interference. 618 provisions had been cancelled or remitted to lower levels of government, and the central government level had passed down 40% out of a total of 200 powers. But that was the extent of its optimism. Among other problems, it noted that Number 1, there was no legislation to back up the measures. Number 2, movement was government-driven rather than by enterprises or their people, and therefore was often inappropriate. Number 3, many provisions had been abolished only in name. Number 4, lower levels did not have competent or technically qualified personnel to manage matters at their level. Number 5, powers had not been adequately defined. Number 6, the new systems necessary for the exercise of powers were not in place, and Number 7, organizations were not sharing information and resources which would allow enterprises a one-stop shop for efficient registration and operation. The claim made in 2020 that reform targets and tasks have generally been completed as scheduled fails to convince in the light of subsequent remarks from CCP leaders. In his government work report, GWR, to the National People's Congress in 2023, Li Keqiang, former premier of the PRC, claimed that over the years, we have cancelled or delegated to lower-level authorities the power of administrative approval for over 1,000 items and slashed the number of investment items subject to central government approval by over 90%. But it is not just the central government which presents a problem to the private sector. Local government, to whom many approval powers were delegated, has continued to interfere. It is clear from the section in the 2021 GWR on advancing reforms in key areas and further energizing market entities that reforms set out in 2013 had not been completed by the 2020 deadline, because a year later Li was still outlining the necessity of implementing these measures. We will build a cordial and clean relationship between government and business, remove barriers to the development of private businesses, and promote an entrepreneurial spirit. The 2022 GWR largely repeats this. Even in 2023, at the July Politburo meeting on the economy, work remained to be done to provide private enterprises with an enabling environment, and in particular firm actions must be taken to crack down on arbitrary charges, fines and quotas, and get outstanding payments owed by governments to enterprises cleared. Because of the impoverishment of local government, these extortions have risen in recent years. Additionally, the high-profile treatment dished out to Alibaba, as well as to other leading private companies, enforced charitable donations, the third distribution mechanism, a fine euphemism, and the establishment and strengthening of CCP cells or branches inside companies have all sent discouraging messages to entrepreneurs about the balance between market and government. Morale and investment appear low. Another problem was regional protectionism. Counties and provinces made it difficult for businesses to sell or expand across local boundaries. Local governments favored their own and kept outsiders away. This problem was recognized in 2013. A unified national economy remains a key concern of Xi Jinping. Hence the emphasis then on the setting up of the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei Zone, Jingjinji. The People's Daily published an article stating that it is unprecedented for the General Secretary of the party to preside over the meeting to study the coordinated development of a region. The Beijing-Tianjin-Hebei Coordinated Development Leading Group will take the lead in making breakthroughs in three key areas: transportation integration, ecological environment protection, and industrial coordinated development. Subsequently, the CCP set up the integration of the Yangtze River Delta, the Yangtze River Economic Belt, the Chengdu-Chongqing Economic Circle, and Greater Bay Area in southern PRC. But clearly progress in breaking down regional obstructionism was slow. In 2018, the Central Committee published opinions on establishing a more effective new mechanism for regional coordinated development. Shortly afterwards, it set up the Central Regional Coordinated Development Leading Group, whose existence only came to light in September 2023. That progress has lagged is confirmed by Xi Jinping's call at the 9 September 2020 meeting of the Central Finance and Economics Commission that it was necessary to accelerate the improvement of the domestic unified large market. Title 3.1.2 State-Owned Enterprise Reform. There was never any doubt in 2013 that SOEs would retain their central role in the economy. We must unswervingly consolidate and develop the public economy, persist in the dominant position of public ownership, give full play to the leading role of the state-owned sector, and continuously increase its vitality, controlling force and influence. The aims of these reforms were to regularize decision-making over operations, grow the value of state assets, set up a level playing field with other enterprises, raise production efficiency, strengthen vitality, and meet their social obligations. Through the setting up of state investment companies, investment was to be directed to important sectors of the economy, national defense, the environment, strategic and emerging industries. SOEs would work under different conditions depending on whether they provided services, were monopolies, or could be exposed to market competition. There was to be greater professionalism, regularized salaries, not least to stop managers milking SOEs, and transparency. Central SOEs would be consolidated, while some local SOEs might succumb to competitors. Under mixed ownership reforms, private sector investment in SOEs and vice versa were to be encouraged to promote an exchange of good business practice. In sum, there was a strong emphasis on separating SOE management from government oversight. As much as possible, they would be run on proper commercial lines, not as administrative adjuncts of government. By 2017, reform had not progressed as planned. The IESM was not complementary. Despite the August 2015 guiding principles on SOE reform and 13 supplementary documents, there had been little implementation for 6 main reasons. Number 1, rampant vested interests, not just in SOEs, but in central ministries and the NDRC, meant no unity and weak design at the central level. 2, the Central Committee failed to appreciate the concerns at local levels and how SOEs actually operated. 3, proposals were not sufficiently scientific, e.g., salary reductions killed managers' enthusiasm. 4, instructions on implementation were insufficiently clear and detailed. 5, fear among implementers. No one wanted to take responsibility, not least for disposing of or reassigning assets, and 6. Local governments looked to their own interests and were unwilling to take action, not least if it might mean missing job evaluation targets, such as for employment or gross domestic product. They therefore worked with SOEs to ensure little change and few cuts. In 2020, the Central Committee and State Council promulgated opinions on speeding up and perfecting the socialist market economic system in the new era. The first substantive section, adhere to public ownership as the main body in the common development of various ownership economies, and enhance the vitality of micro-entities, makes it clear that, although SOE reform should have been completed by 2020, little progress had been made in its essence, namely the better use of state capital, mixed ownership reforms, and the altering of natural monopoly industries. This still appears to be the case. Lee's 2021 GWR gave an unconvincing assessment. We will continue to implement the 3-year action plan for SOE reform, and work to strengthen, expand, and increase the returns on state capital and enhance the strength, quality, and size of SOEs. We will also push ahead with mixed ownership reform in SOEs. The 2022 GWR was no more positive. Nor was Xi Jinping himself, speaking at this July's first meeting of the Central Commission for Comprehensively Deepening Reform under the 20th CCP Central Committee. Efforts should be done to deepen reform of state-owned enterprises and focus on addressing inadequacies, strengthening weak areas, consolidating fundamentals, and giving full play to strengths so as to build a management system of the state-owned sector that has top-level coordination, clear rights and responsibilities, efficient operation and powerful supervision. Recall that this is a decade after reforms were announced and 3 years after the deadline for completion. Title 3.1.3 Financial and Fiscal Reform. Finance is the foundation and an important pillar of state governance, so declared the introduction to Section V of the decision of 2013's Third Plenum. As Lou Jiwei, former Minister of Finance, stressed in 2015. Only by achieving fundamental breakthroughs in the reform of the fiscal and taxation systems can we provide the material foundation and institutional guarantee for realizing the modernization of national governance and the 2 centenary goals. Liu affirmed that it was not just a question of tinkering with the system and mechanisms. Reform was to be divided into 3 parts. Number 1, establishing a comprehensive, standardized, open and transparent modern budget system. Number 2, establishing and improving a tax system conducive to scientific development, social equity, and market unity, and Number 3, adjusting the fiscal relationship between the central and local governments, and establishing a system in which administrative powers and expenditure responsibilities are compatible. The June 2014 Overall Plan for Deepening the Reform of the Fiscal and Taxation System set a deadline for basic completion by 2016, while also stating that a modern fiscal system will be basically established in 2020. Liu was clear that the task would be tough to fulfill. He reiterated several times the CCP cliché of crossing the river by feeling the stones. The opinion of the NDRC's IESM in 2017 was that while the reform of the budgetary system had largely been implemented, the other 2 tasks had made slow progress. Surprisingly hard-hitting though the NDRC IESM is, slow progress is an overstatement. There has been some feeling of stones, but little crossing of rivers. Thus, real estate tax, long talked of, has not arrived. Shanghai and Chongqing have carried out Shurdian experimental zones, and the necessary preliminary of registering ownership of property is, apparently, largely complete. But a decade on from the 2013 reforms, the tax remains unimposed, and last year further experiments were put on hold. In practical terms, a property tax is not difficult to implement, hiding ownership is hard. But in political terms, it is. How many CCP officials and their families have multiple properties, which their salaries cannot possibly have afforded? And how would the people react to what in effect is a tax on their savings, so much of which has been put in property, and which is now falling in value? What about the impact on the already troubled property companies? The CCP's motto for economic progress has long been amidst stability seek progress, but stability, i.e., the party's political security, always comes first. Nor has income tax reform helped national finances. Income tax makes up around 6% of the state's revenue, compared to an average of 23.5% in countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in 2016. the opinions of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China and the State Council on Accelerating the Improvement of the Socialist Market Economic System in the New Era, released on 18 May 2020, show that no progress had been made. It recognized a need to deepen the reform of the tax system, improve the direct tax system and gradually increase its proportion, establish and improve a comprehensive and classified personal income tax system. The 2023 NDRC work report promised to improve local tax systems and the individual income tax system. This again shows how little has been done in the last decade. The other major task listed in the 2020 opinions was to optimize the division of administrative and financial powers among governments, establish central and local fiscal relations with clear powers and responsibilities, coordinated financial resources, and balanced regional arrangements, and form a stable system in which the administrative powers, expenditure responsibilities, and financial resources of governments at all levels are compatible. Yet, that task is merely a repeat of the reforms set out at the third plenum of 2013 and in the 2014 plan, which aim to correct the problems caused by local governments being responsible for around 85% of expenditure on social services, while receiving only just over 50% of revenue, the rest going to central government. The 2013 decision talks of dividing responsibilities into three categories of central, joint center/local, and local. Responsibility for expenditure would be delineated accordingly. As the IESM put it, the August 2016 guiding principles for the division of central and local government responsibilities and revenues contained no practical implementing regulations. Nor has the situation improved. In sum, much of financial and fiscal reform is, as the IESM summarized it, loud thunder, sparse rain. Title 3.1.4 Labor Mobility, Hukou and Rural Land Reform. The Hukou, household registration system, is an important feature of a Chinese citizen's life. Everyone is registered to a particular city, town, or rural area, and that locality is responsible for supplying their basic services such as education, health, retirement, or unemployment insurance. Changing the location of one's Hukou has never been easy. This is a brake on urbanization, labor mobility, and productivity, as well as a cause of hardship and discontent. Those classified as rural migrants do not enjoy the Hukou of their city of residence. They can only access medical treatment or education where they are registered, usually back in their villages. They are second-class citizens. Services are far better in the major cities, but they are not sufficient to cover all comers. Those enjoying an urban Hukou resent rural migrants taking up scarce places in good schools or beds in hospitals, and there have been protests. Given that 70% of the PRC's children are in the countryside, this is a severe restraint on bright children picking up the skills needed in a high-tech economy. The 2013 decision speaks of granting the Hukou at 4 different speeds. We will introduce new population management methods, accelerate the reform of household registration system, completely lift restrictions on new residence registration in administrative townships and small cities, relax restrictions on new residence registration in medium-sized cities in an orderly manner, lay down appropriate conditions for new residence registration in large cities, and strictly control the population size of megacities. Attempts to reform the Hukou system began well before the third plenum of 2013. Unifying rural and urban labor standards also appears in the 2003 third plenum decision and in 2008. The 12th five-year plan released in March 2011, the product of long preparation, was the first specifically to mention household registration reform in a standalone chapter on urbanization. The Hukou problem is intimately linked with rural land reform. Migrant workers would protest if they were deprived of their land use rights, since the land represents an insurance policy if times turn hard in the city, they have something to return to, which would ward off privation, even starvation. Yet the land is often not being properly used and farms can be too small, all at a time when food security is a major policy preoccupation. Again, the IESM reveals that by 2017 progress was minimal. It highlighted a lack of a clear policy direction, provisions which only touched the surface of the problem. Decreeing the abolition of the Hukou was one thing, providing equal access to benefits for all was quite another. Land reform had not taken place, not least because without financial and fiscal reform local governments continued to rely on exploiting rural land for revenue. Nor did they have the money to underwrite the provisions of Social Security, granting the hukou to one person in the Haidian district of Beijing would cost around £1,110,600. Too many organizations were involved in the hukou, each with their own vested interests. Those bigger cities which had instituted a points system for qualification for an urban hukou kept the target too high. The IESM lists solutions, but they involve large sums of money, the politically delicate question of land reform, a solution to the division of costs and revenues between central and local governments, allowing local governments flexibility, and breaking up the vested interests of organizations and ministries. Progress since has been labored. In 2019, Liu, by then ex-Minister of Finance, described the current household registration system as a major and unreasonable institutional issue. He went on, due to the differences in basic public services between urban and rural areas, between regions, between large and medium-sized cities, and the difficulties in the free flow of people, the reform is difficult. He laid much of the blame on the failure to implement land reform. The rural labor force should flow freely and should not be treated differently from urban workers. The land should be freely traded under the control of use. The NDRC report to the NPC in March 2023 promised to speed up the work of expanding permanent urban residency and associated social services to migrants. We will steadily advance people-centered new urbanization. We will work faster to grant permanent urban residency to eligible people who move from rural to urban areas, advance reform of the household registration system in a prudent and orderly manner, promote equitable access to basic public services in cities, and step up efforts to provide people who move from rural to urban areas with basic public services such as employment assistance, skills training, and social security. Other plans and announcements throughout 2023 also show that hukou reform has a long way to go 3 years after it should have been completed. In July, the Zhejiang government published its plan for widening the hukou by 2027. Zhejiang province is the experimental zone for the Common Prosperity Policy, which aims to reduce inequalities, so other areas are likely to be further behind. In August, the Ministry of Public Security announced new measures aiming to promote the complete abolition of settlement restrictions in cities with a permanent urban population of less than 3 million, fully relax the settlement requirements for Type I large cities with an urban permanent population of 3 to 5 million, and improve the point-based settlement policy for super-large cities with an urban permanent population of more than 5 million. Ensure that the social insurance payment period and the residence period score account for the main proportion, and encourage the cancellation of the annual settlement quota limit. Jiangsu Province also released draft measures eliminating hukou restrictions everywhere except in its 2 major cities. All this represents an advance in intention. But, as ever, implementation is all and deadlines are distant. Title 4.0. Do the 3 UNS still apply? For all Xi Jinping's claim that 2,485 reforms had been launched, without reform of the above 4 main pillars, the Chinese economic and social model remains uncoordinated, unbalanced and unsustainable, and, like Wen Jiabao, it is tempting to add unstable. This would suggest that this year there needs to be a third plenum as momentous as its 2013 predecessor was intended to be. Title 4.1 Reform amidst high winds, choppy waters and even dangerous storms. Since 2013, both the internal and external environment for reform have taken a turn for the worse. Internally, the chickens of the system's inadequacy have come home to roost. The problems of debt, local government financing, the real estate sector, and a failure to rebalance investment, exports and consumption, all stem from the current unsustainable model. Other problems, such as demographic decline, unemployment, an inadequately educated workforce, and a skills mismatch may also have been exacerbated by mistakes, systemic delays or difficulties in implementing policies. A long-term water scarcity crisis threatens provinces containing over half of the PRC's agriculture, industry, power generation, and population. Externally, free and open countries have awoken to the threat which the CCP's model and its ambitions pose. A willingness to help or to tolerate its effects is changing to a determination to minimize that threat. CCP rhetoric has changed accordingly. The major difficulties, prominent challenges and contradictions, the deep water zone of Xi Jinping's 2013 explanation have moved through gnawing hard bones to high winds, choppy waters, and even dangerous storms. Reform is destabilizing at the best of times. It is one thing to reform when optimism abounds, resources plentiful and problems smaller, quite another when the economy is in trouble. In 2014, Jean Galli, then a Politburo Standing Committee member, rightly echoed the British historian, Thomas Carlyle, "We should face the morning light as we carry out China's reform, not dream as we face the sunset." This year's plenum is certainly late in the day. Title 4.2 bumping up against the limits of Leninism, no political reform. Some credit the CCP with a reputation for flexibility. This was easier to justify as it cut away from the straitjacket of Maoism. Both Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin were able to make economic gains while relaxing, but still staying inside ideological boundaries. But by the time of Hu Jintao, the strains were showing. The CCP feared that further political, social, and some elements of economic laxity would threaten its hold on power. Xi Jinping was chosen as leader because the CCP saw him as the person to restore discipline and control. The last decade has seen the return of Marxist ideology, centralization, partification, strengthening of the CCP in all organizations and sectors, and the prioritization of national security over economic performance. Of the 16 elements of national security, political, i.e., CCP, security is the most important. This is detrimental to initiative, experimentation, and innovation in governance. Xi Jinping's belief, or bet, is that the PRC can thrive economically and socially under a political model of totalitarian control, and that the CCP can continue to eschew political reform. He will persist in running the PRC's enormous economy and population through top-down command, inspection, and campaigns. Considerable energy and time will have to be spent on party discipline, activities, and study. Such a political model dispenses with 4 elements which could help make the model more self-regulating. Number 1, an independent press, to stimulate ideas and policies, highlight abuses of power and promote discipline in government. Number 2, an independent judiciary, to engender trust both in business and in wider society. Number 3, civil society, to raise ideas and pressure, both rarely come from government officials in any political system, and Number 4, some form of political accountability, real democracy, to encourage rulers to serve the people more effectively rather than their own or the CCP's interests. These 4 elements are anathema to Xi Jinping, and almost certainly to whomever succeeds him, since allowing them to flourish would lead either to the CCP losing power or having to transform itself, perhaps in the way in which the Kuomintang, KMT, did in Taiwan. Title 5 The 2023 Third Plenum delayed, expectations for reform? According to the constitution of the CCP, it is for the Politburo to convene a plenum and at least one must be held annually. Against expectations, the Politburo meetings of September and October did not announce a date for a third plenum. If the third plenum is to be held in 2023, it will now have to be in December, given that the Politburo meets monthly and at the end of the month. Yet this would bump up against the important annual Central Economic Work Conference, which usually takes place around 10th December. Since the second plenum took place in February, as usual just before the convening of the National People's Congress, there is no requirement to hold the third plenum this year, if Xi Jinping so decides. It is also possible that the third plenum might not center on the economy, as happened, if unusually, in 2018. Xi Jinping may for example wish to align an economy-focused plenum with the adoption of the next 5-year plan, due in 2025. But whenever a plenum centered on the economy does take place, despite the need for new measures to help the PRC through current turbulence, it is hard to expect much more than the repetition of the reform rhetoric of the last few years. Talk of action over the 4 pillars of reform, of unifying the market, of reducing inequalities, Xi Jinping's common prosperity agenda, will abound. But, to take the example of SOE reform, it is hard to conceive of breakthroughs beyond the latest 3-year plan, which is due to be completed shortly. The bars of Chen's ideological birdcage for the economy are not going to be removed. The underlying reason is ultimately a refusal to countenance meaningful reform of the political system. One thing which is likely to be seen is yet more emphasis on innovation, science and technology as the way of cutting the political and economic Gordian knot. This has been a constant theme from Xi Jinping, and very large sums of money have been dedicated to innovation, with some impressive results. But the jury remains out on whether this will be sufficient to make up for the negatives of an otherwise unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable system. Top-down innovation, funded and directed from the center, can only go so far. Political control reinforces cultural biases against iconoclasm or the freedom to wander down paths unauthorized, which are major contributors to innovation, whether in technology or governance. Another factor is the skills mismatch. Currently, high-tech companies cannot find sufficiently expert staff, yet youth unemployment exceeds 20%, a long-term problem resulting from insufficient investment in basic education, something exacerbated by the failure to reform the hukou system. Title 5.1 Longer-term expectations. The CCP has long declared its second centenary goal, by the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC in 2049, as the establishment of its strong, democratic, civilized, harmonious, and modern socialist country. Translated from party speak, this means supplanting the United States as the preeminent superpower and making global governance the handmaid of the PRC's own interests and values. Increasingly, too, Xi Jinping has talked about Chinese modernization setting, a good example for developing countries to move towards modernization independently, and has provided them with a new choice. In the years before COVID-19, many assumed that the PRC would inevitably become the world's biggest economy and most powerful nation. This author has long doubted that. Now the optimism of others has curdled into warnings of stagnation or even collapse. Talk is of peak China. This is the wrong geological metaphor. Peaks rise and fall sharply. The CCP's economic and social model, by its own admission, is unsustainable without reform. Nevertheless, even without reform, the likelihood is that the PRC will remain a powerful force over the coming decades. It has plateaued, but plateaus can stretch considerable distances, although it is true that sometimes they descend precipitately at the far end. For the sake of the Chinese people and indeed global economic interdependencies, the hope must be that the descent from the plateau is gradual.